Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Emma, you're at CrimeStories Obsessed, and today we're talking about a true crime case involving Mary Bell, who was born on the 26th of May 1957, and as an English woman who, as a juvenile, murdered two preschool-aged boys in Scotswood, an inner suburb of Newcastle upon Tyne, and this was in 1968. The first murder happened when she was just 10 years of age. So let's get into the case. So her early life, she was born to her mother, Betty, who was a well-known prostitute and often absent from the family home, frequently travelling to Glasgow to work and simply leaving her children in the care of their father, if he was present, that was. Mary was the second child born, when Betty herself was just 17 years of age. The identity of Mary's biological father is kind of unknown. That was for most of her life. Mary believed her father to be William Bell, a violent alcoholic and habitual criminal with an arrest record for crimes including armed robbery. However, she was a baby when William Bell married her mother, and it's unknown if he was her actual biological father. Now, Mary was an unwanted child. She was also neglected. Within minutes of being born, her mother resented the hospital staff for attempting to place her daughter in her arms, shouting, "Take that thing away from me." As a baby, toddler and young girl, Mary frequently suffered injuries in the household, accidents, while alone with her mother, which led her family to believe that either her mother was deliberately negligent and hurting her child, attempting to harm or even kill her. And on one occasion, in about 1960, Betty, her mother, dropped her daughter from a first-floor window, and on another occasion, she plied her daughter with sleeping pills. She's also known to have once sold Mary to a mentally unstable woman who was unable to have a child of her own, resulting in her older sister, Catherine, having to travel alone across Newcastle to reclaim Mary from this individual and return the child to her mother's home in White House Road. Now, despite her negligence and abuse of her child, Betty refused repeated offers from her family to take custody of Mary, whom she, as a dominatrix, is alleged to have begun allowing or encouraging several of her clients to sexually abuse her daughter. Both at home and at school, Mary exhibited numerous signs of disturbed and unpredictable behaviour, including sudden mood swings and chronic bedwetting. She is known to have frequently fought with other children, both boys and girls, and have attempted to strangle or suffocate her classmates or playmates on several occasions. On one occasion, she is known to have attempted to block the trachea of a young girl with sand. This violent behaviour made many children reluctant to socialise with Mary, and parents concerned for their children that she would spend time with in her free time. Their parents were concerned. According to one classmate at the junior school where she attended, that by 1968, she and her peers had become accustomed to the sudden and marked changes in Mary's behaviour, and when she began exhibiting stressful mannerisms, including shaking her head and forming a steely glaze at her peers, instinctively they knew she was to become violent, with the focus of her stare being the individual she would attack. On Saturday, the 11th of May 1968, a 3-year-old boy was discovered wandering dazed and bleeding in the vicinity of St Margaret's Road, Scotswood. The child later informed police that he had been playing with Mary Bell and Norma Bell near a disused air raid shelter, and when one of the girls, the child was unsure which, had pushed him 7 feet from roof to ground, inflicting a severe laceration to his head. And the same evening, the parents of 3 small girls contacted the police also to complain that both Mary and Norma had attempted to strangle their children as they played in a sandpit. That evening, both girls were interviewed about these incidents, and both girls denied any culpability for the air raid shelter incident, claiming they had simply discovered the boy bleeding heavily from a head wound after he'd fallen. Further questioned about the attempted strangulation of the 3 young girls, Mary denied any knowledge of the incident. However, Norma admitted Mary had tried to throttle each of the girls, stating Mary went to one of the girls and said, "What happens if you choke? Do they die?" When Mary put both hands around the girl's throat and squeezed, the girl started to go purple. I told Mary to stop. Then she put her hands around Pauline's throat and she started going purple as well. Another girl, Susan Cornish, came up and Mary did the same to her. Police notified the local authority of the incidents and of Mary's violent nature, but due to their age, both girls were simply given a warning and no further action was taken. Now, in the 1960s, Newcastle upon Tyne experienced a significant urban renewal project. Many inner boroughs of the city saw Victorian end terraced houses demolished in order that modern houses and flats could be constructed. Although several families resided in buildings earmarked for demolition as they awaited rehousing by the council, local children frequently played in or close to the derelict houses and upon the rubble-strewn expanses of land raised and partially cleared by contractors. One of these locations was a large expanse of waste ground located close to the railway line, known to local children as Tin Lizzie. The street which ran parallel to this expanse of waste ground was St Margaret's Road. Now, on the 25th of May 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, Mary Bell strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown in an upstairs bedroom of a derelict house located at 85 St Margaret's Road. She is believed to have committed this crime alone. Brown's body was discovered by 3 children at approximately 3:30 p.m. He was lying on his back with his arms stretched above his head. Aside from specks of blood and foam around his mouth, no signs of violence was visible upon his body. A local workman named John Hall soon arrived at the scene. He attempted to perform CPR to no avail. As he attempted CPR, 2 local girls, 10-year-old Mary Bell and her 13-year-old friend and neighbour Norma Bell, appeared at the doorway to the bedroom. Both were quickly shooed out of the house. The 2 knocked on the door of Martin's aunt and informed her. The following day, Mr. Bernard Knight conducted a post-mortem upon the body of Martin Brown. Knight was unable to find any signs of violence on the child's body and thus was unable to determine the child's cause of death, although he was able to discount the investigators' theory that the child had died of poisoning through ingesting tablets. An inquest on the 7th of June returned an open verdict. On Mary's 11th birthday, she and Norma broke into and vandalised a nursery in nearby Woodland Crescent. The 2 entered the premises by peeling tiles off the slate roof. They tore books up, upturned desks, and smeared ink and poster paints about the property before escaping. The following day, staff discovered the break-in and vandalism and immediately notified the police, who also discovered 4 separate notes, which claimed responsibility for Martin's murder. One of them read, "I murder so that I may come back." Another read, "We did murder Martin Brown. Fuck off, you bastard." A third note simply read, "Fuck off, we murder, watch out, Fanny and faggot." The police dismissed this incident as a tasteless and childish prank. 2 days later, on the 29th of May, shortly before the funeral of Martin Brown, In a game of chicken, both girls called upon the house of his mother, June, asking to see her son. When June Brown replied that they couldn't see her son because he was deceased, Mary replied, "Oh, I know he's dead. I just want to see him in his coffin." On the afternoon of the 31st of July 1968, a 3-year-old boy named Brian Howe was last seen by his parents in the street outside of his house, playing with one of his siblings, the family dog, and Mary Bell and Norma Bell. When he did not return home later that afternoon, concerned relatives and neighbours searched the streets without success. And at 11:10 p.m, a search party discovered Brian's body between two large concrete blocks upon the Tin Lizzie. The first policeman to arrive at the scene observed that a deliberate but feeble attempt had been made to conceal the body, which was covered in clumps of grass and weeds. Cyanosis, which is like purpling of the skin, was evident upon the child's lips, and several bruises and scratches were evident upon his neck. A pair of broken scissors lay close to his feet. The coroner would conclude that Brian had died of strangulation and that he had been deceased for up to 7.5 hours before the discovery of his body. The killer had evidently squeezed Brian's nostrils closed with one hand as he or she had gripped his throat with the other. Numerous puncture wounds had been inflicted to the child's legs before death. Sections of his hair had been cut from his head. His genitals had been partially mutilated, and a crude attempt had been made to carve the initial M into his stomach. The relatively small amount of force used to murder the child led the coroner to conclude the murder was another child. Numerous grey and maroon fibres were discovered upon Brian's clothing and shoes. These fibres did not source from any clothing within the Howe household and had been transferred to the boy via the murderers. The discovery of Brian Howe's body sparked a large-scale manhunt. Over 100 detectives from across Northumberland were assigned to the investigation, and more than 1,200 children had been questioned with regard to their whereabouts on the 2nd of August. 2 children questioned by detectives on the 1st of August were Mary Bell and Norma Bell, whom witnesses had already informed investigators had been seen playing with Brian shortly before he was believed to have died. In her initial interview, Norma seemed excitable, whereas Mary was markedly more observant. Although both girls were evasive and contradictory in their initial statements, they freely admitted to having played with Brian on the date of his death, but denied having seen him after lunchtime. Questioned further the following day, Mary stated she remembered seeing an 8-year-old local boy playing with Brian on the afternoon of the 31st of July, and that she had also seen him hitting the child. Furthermore, she stated that she also remembered that the boy had been covered in grass and weeds, as if he had been rolling in a field, and that he had in his possession a small pair of scissors. Then she said, "I saw him trying to cut a cat's tail off with the scissors, but there was something wrong with them. One leg was broken or bent." This self-incriminating statement convinced Detective Inspector James Dobson that Mary was the actual killer, as only the police knew about the broken scissors found at the crime scene. In addition, the local boy she named was quickly questioned and was discovered to have been at Newcastle International Airport on the afternoon of the 31st of July, with numerous witnesses able to corroborate his parents' claims. On the afternoon of the 4th of August, the parents of Norma Bell contacted the police, stating their daughter wished to confess and that she knew of the death of Brian Howe. Again, DCI Dobson arrived at their home, formally cautioned Norma, then asked what she knew. Norma had informed Dobson that Mary had taken her to a spot on Tin Lizzie, at which point she had been shown Brian's body. Mary had then demonstrated to her how she had then strangled the child. According to Norma, Mary had confessed to her that she'd enjoyed strangling the child before describing how she inflicted the score marks into his stomach with a razor blade, which had been hidden at the crime scene, and the broken scissors. Norma had then led police to the crime scene and revealed the location where the razor blade was hidden. A drawing Norma made of the wounds inflicted to the boy's abdomen precisely matched those described by the coroner. Mary Bell was visited at her home in the early hours of the 5th of August. On this occasion, she was notably defensive. When confronted with the discrepancies in her previous statement, she informed detectives, "You're trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this." This is a 10-year-old, guys. Later the same day, Norma was questioned again, and on this occasion she made a full statement in which she admitted being present when Mary had actually strangled Brian. According to Norma, when the trio were alone on the Tin Lizzie, Mary seemed to go all funny, pushing the child into the grass before attempting to strangle him before stating, "My hands are getting tired, please take over." She had then run from the scene, leaving Mary alone with Brian. A forensic examination of the clothing owned by the girls revealed the grey fibres discovered upon Brian's body were a precise match to a woolen dress owned by Mary. The maroon fibres upon the child's shoes were a precise match to the skirt owned by Norma. Furthermore, the grey fibres that had also been found upon the body of Martin Brown. Now, Brian Howe was buried in a local cemetery on the 7th of August 1968, in a cemetery attended by over 200 people, including DCI Dobson, who had planned to arrest both girls later that day. Mary Bell stood outside the Howe household as the child's coffin was brought from the home at the beginning of the funeral procession. DCI had later stated that the girls stood there, laughing and rubbing their hands. He said, "My God, I've got to bring them in." Both girls were formally charged with the murder of Brian Howe at 8 p.m. that evening, and in response to this charge, Mary replied, "That's all right by me." Norma burst into tears, simply proclaiming, I'll pay you back for this." In the presence of an independent witness, Mary prepared a written statement in which she admitted to being present when Brian Howe was murdered, but insisting the murder had been committed by Norma. She also admitted she and Norma had broken into the Woodland Crescent nursery the day before the murder of Martin Brown, defacing the property before the two had written the 4 handwritten notes. Shortly after their arrest, both girls underwent psychological evaluations. The results of these tests revealed that Norma was intellectually delayed and a submissive character who easily displayed emotion, whereas Mary had a bright yet cunning character, prone to sudden mood swings. The 4 psychiatrists who examined Mary concluded that although not suffering from a mental disorder, she suffered from a psychopathic personality disorder. In his official report compiled for the Director of Public Prosecutions, the doctor concluded Mary's social techniques are primitive and take the form of automatic denial, manipulation, complaining, bullying, flight, or violence. The trial of Mary Bell and Norma Bell for the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe began at Newcastle on the 5th of December 1968. Both girls were tried before Mr. Justice Ralph Cusack, and both pleaded not guilty to the charges. Against protests from both defence and counsel, on the first day of the trial, Cusack waived the defendants' right to anonymity on account of their age. As such, the media were allowed to publicise the names, ages and photographs of both girls, who each sat alongside plainclothed female police officers in the centre of the court, behind their legal representatives, and within arm's reach of their families throughout the duration of the trial. On behalf of the prosecution, in an opening statement lasting 6 hours, Lyons informed the jury they faced an unhappy and distressing task due to the nature of the murders and the ages of the defendants. He then outlined the prosecution's intention to illustrate the similarities between both murders, which indicated both boys had been murdered by the same juveniles. The prosecution concluded in his opening statement that despite the defendants' age difference, Mary was the more dominant of the two, and he contended both girls had acted in unison and were equally culpable for killing both children solely for the pleasure and excitement of murder, adding, both girls well knew what they were doing and they knew it was wrong. On the 5th day of the trial, Norma testified in her own defence, and she denied any culpability in the actual murder of either child, but admitted under cross-examination to having known Mary's penchant for violence and her history of attacking children, and that she had also discussed attacking and killing small children of both genders, and that the two had discussed attacking and killing small children. Questioned by Rudolph Lyons as to whether Mary had demonstrated to her how children could be killed, Norma nodded, and then she conceded that as Mary had begun to attack and strangle Brian Howe, she had failed to alert a group of boys playing in the vicinity, stating she had failed to do so as "I did not know what was going to happen in the first place." She had stopped hurting him for a bit when the boys were near the concrete blocks. Questioned as to her own role in the murder, Norma stated she had never touched the child. Following the conclusion of Norma's testimony on the 12th of December, Mary testified in her own defence. Her testimony lasted for almost 4 hours, concluding on the 13th of December, and was briefly adjourned on one occasion when she began crying in a policewoman's arms. She denied her co-defendant's accusations, insisting that although she had observed the body of Martin Brown at St. Margaret's Road, she herself had never harmed the child, and that she and Norma had later asked the boy's mother to view the body as the two were daring each other and one of us did not want to be chicken. Mary also conceded she had divulged to others her knowledge of Martin's death, could get Norma put straight away in prison. Questioned with regards to the death of Brian Howe, Mary claimed that Norma had been the individual who strangled the child, as she herself was just standing and looking. I couldn't move. It was as if I had some glue pulling us down. Mary then alleged Norma had encouraged Brian to lie down if he wanted some sweets, telling him, "You've got to lie down for the lady to come with the sweets," before proceeding to strangle him with her bare hands, as she herself unsuccessfully attempted to prevent the attack. Mary further stated that she could determine the level of force Norma exhibited because her fingertips and nails were going white, and again conceded she had failed to inform authorities of her knowledge of Norma's actions out of both fear and a misguided sense of loyalty. Norma's mother, Catherine, then testified that several months prior to the murder of Brian Howe, she and her husband had discovered Mary attempting to strangle Norma's younger sister, Susan, and that she had only released her grip on her daughter's throat after her husband had punched Mary in the shoulder. A child psychiatrist named Ian Fraser then testified that Norma's mental age was 8 years and 10 months, and that, although her capacity of knowing right from wrong was limited, she was capable of appreciating the criminality of the act she was accused of committing. On the 13th of December, Norma's defence counsel R.P. Smith delivered his closing argument to the jury, and Smith emphasised that although both girls were on trial together, no real evidence existed against his client. The only evidence against Norma was Mary's accusations against her. Harvey Robson then delivered his closing statement on behalf of Mary. He illustrated her broken background and dysfunctional family and the blur between fantasy and reality in her mind. He also referenced the testimony of Dr. David Westbury, who had testified on behalf of the defense. He had interviewed Mary on several occasions prior to the trial and had formed a definitive view that the child suffered a serious personality disorder, which he classified as a retarded development of the mind. He said that this had been caused by both genetics and environmental factors. Referencing the notes both girls had left in a nursery after the murder of Martin Brown, Robson stated that the notes proved the crimes were a childish fantasy and in Mary's case were written to attract attention to herself. The trial lasted 9 days, and on the 17th of December the jury retired to consider their verdict and would deliberate for 3 hours and 25 minutes before reaching their verdicts. Mary Bell was cleared of murder, but convicted of the manslaughter of both boys on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges upon hearing the jury's verdicts. Norma clapped her hands in excitement, whereas Mary burst into tears as her mother and grandmother wept. Passing sentence, Judge Cusack described Bell as a dangerous individual, adding she posed a very grave risk to other children and that steps must be taken to protect the public from her. She was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, effectively an indefinite sentence of imprisonment. She was initially detained in Durham Remand Home before being transferred to a second remand home in South Norwood. She was then transferred to Red Bank Secure Unit, a young offenders institution in Newton de Willows in Merseyside in early 1969, where she was the only female of approximately 24 inmates. She would later claim that she was sexually abused by a member of staff and several inmates while incarcerated at this facility, claiming the sexual abuse began when she was aged 13. And in November 1973, at the age of 16, she was transferred to a secure wing, Her Majesty's Prison in Style in Cheshire. Reportedly, she resented her transition, and while incarcerated at Her Majesty's Prison, Bell successfully applied for parole. In June 1976, she was transferred to Moore Court Open Prison, where she undertook a secretarial course. 15 months later, in September 1977, Bell again made national headlines when she and another inmate briefly escaped from this open prison. Both escapees spent several days in the company of 2 young men in Blackpool, visiting the amusements, sleeping in various local hotels, where Bell used the alias of Mary Robson before both escapees parted company. Bell was arrested in Derbyshire at the home of one of the men, Clive Shirtcliffe, on the 13th of September, having by this stage dyed her hair blonde in an effort to disguise her identity, and she was returned to the custody that evening. The man was later arrested in Leeds days later, her penalty for absconding was a loss of prison privileges for 28 days. In June 1979, the Home Office announced their decision to transfer Mary Bell to HM Prison Askham Grange, an open category prison in the village of Askham Richard, in efforts to prepare her for her eventual release into society, which was planned for the following year. Beginning in November 1979, she worked first as a secretary and then as a waitress at a cafe in York Minster under supervision guidelines in efforts to prepare her for eventual release. She was later released from prison in Askham Grange in May 1980 at the age of 23, having served almost 11 and a half years in custody, and she was granted anonymity. What do you think about this, guys? Do you think somebody, even if you've committed crimes when you're young, that you have a chance after 11 years to be able to integrate back into society? And so she started her life elsewhere in the country under an assumed identity, but upon release, she's quoted as saying, "I wish to have the chance to live a normal life and just be left alone." So 4 years after her release from custody on the 25th of May 1984, she gave birth to a daughter, and this would prove to be her only child. Her daughter knew nothing of her mother's past until 1998, when the reporters discovered her then location in a resort town near the beach on the Sussex coast, where both had been living for approximately 18 months. Now, this media revelation forced her and her 14-year-old daughter to leave their home and be driven to a safe house by undercover officers. Both mother and daughter had later then relocated to another part of the United Kingdom. So she allegedly returned to Tyneside on several occasions in the years following her release, and she also alleged to have lived in the location for some time, so tried to go back home to be maybe close to her family. Now, the right to anonymity granted to her daughter following her birth was originally only extended until she reached the age of 18. However, on the 21st of May 2003, the mother, Belle, did win a High Court battle to have her own anonymity and that of her daughter extended for life. And this order was approved by Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss. And that was later updated to Belle's granddaughter as well in July 2009. She was referred to as Z. The order also prohibits the divulging of any aspects of their lives which may identify them. Now, in 1998, Belle collaborated with a writer and author, Gita Serini, to provide an account of her life before and after her crimes for Serini's book that she wrote in 1998, and that, if you're interested, is called Cries Unheard, the Story of Mary Belle. And within this book, she details the abuse that she suffered as a child that was at the hands of her mother. As we said, she was a prostitute, and she described like the way that she was a dominatrix, and she alleges within this book that several of her mother's clients had her. Now, of course, Belle's whereabouts are unknown and remain protected by the 2003 High Court order. But according to the lady who wrote the book, Serini, Belle does not claim she was wrongly convicted and freely admits the abuse she suffered as a child does not excuse the crimes she committed. So what do you think to that, guys? Do you think she should have been able to move on and have that life? Do you think 11 years was enough? Do you think that a crime that was committed as a child should, still stand even in later life and she should have been given longer? Or do you think there is that chance after 11 years, seeing as it was committed when she was young, that there is that chance for her to grow and move forward in a positive way? Do you think that the abuse that she had upon her as a child reflected the way that she would then initially turn out to become and could grow up to become a child that could commit crimes like this? I mean, I certainly believe a lot of the psychology books that I read, and how a child between the ages of sort of 1.5, 2 and the ages of 5, that the way that they are brought up within those young years can have a detrimental effect on their mental health, their mental well-being, the way that they grow up to be, just due to the fact that they look for so much love and guidance from their mother at that age. And if she wasn't given that, it can make people become narcissistic and all sorts of things at the bare minimum, So I'd be really interested to know what you think about this crime, guys. I hope you enjoyed this case. If you did, please give this a thumbs up. If you like the video, please subscribe and, check out my other content. And I'll be back with you again soon, guys. Until then, stay safe. Take care. Bye.